let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review of Presence. This was a movie that had me by the trailer. What this movie is about: family moves into a house, figure out the house is haunted. We've been here before, time and time again, but how Presence is different, the way this movie set itself apart, the way it sold itself in the trailer and all the marketing, instead of seeing it from the family's point of view, you see it from the demonic presence point of view, which I thought was fascinating. When I saw the trailer, I initially thought that director Steven Soderbergh had like a drone going in this house, because the camera just kind of levitates through every room. It goes up the stairs. It comes back down very quickly at moments where you see this demonic presence kind of take over. The screen starts shaking. I thought that was such a unique and fascinating way to capture a movie like this. And I love the house is haunted genre. Whenever the house is haunted, I'm in. So that is why I was excited going into this movie. I also love movies that are made on a really low budget. This entire movie cost $2 million to make, and it feels like that. I also kind of feel like you have to know that it's only a $2 million movie going into it, because I think some people set different standards, and I know you're still paying the same ticket price, but when you go into something knowing that it does have a lower budget and it's relying more on the creativity of the filmmaker, I feel like you have to judge it a little bit differently. And for me, I also kind of have to remember that horror movies don't always have to be scary every single time. And I think if you look just in the last year of how impactful scary movies in the horror genre have been, I know people call them scary movies, people call horror movies, they have been the most ambitious in their plots and their style of filmmaking. That is where I think the most original stories are coming from right now, because I think you can have a lot of fun inside of this genre. It's one that doesn't take itself too seriously. If you don't go into every horror movie expecting it to be scary and considering it a failure when it's not scary, I think you're setting yourself up for more just good times while watching horror movies. Because I really think when it comes to the horror genre, it doesn't mean I'm going to go in here and there's going to be a bunch of frightening things and I'm going to have nightmares. I think you're going into something thinking stuff is going to go down in this movie. There is going to be something wrong that is not normal. That's kind of how I see the horror genre now. There's something creepy going on. There's something not quite of this world happening. That is what I'm going into every horror movie thinking now, and kind of losing that mentality that we probably all gained with the slasher films of the 80s and 90s and a lot of the found footage horror movies from the 2000s, everything that The Ring started and all the Paranormal Activity movies. I think horror is becoming so much more creative. Look at movies like The Substance. Look at movies like Longlegs in just the last year. And Presence, although would have put in the same category of those movies, it is still a movie that reminds me how beautiful filmmaking is. Like the director of this movie, Steven Soderbergh, would just walk around the house with this small camera, not a big fancy camera. The movie felt very raw, and it's not really intended to be a found footage movie, but it felt like there was no lighting. And I was like, how did they achieve this? Like, how did they get these scenes to look just right? And I was right. There wasn't a big fancy crew to this movie. It was really just him walking around with the camera. I think at times he just had slippers on. He would go as quietly as possible in these one-shot swoops to get this image that felt like you were floating through the house, that you were that demonic presence. So you yourself as the viewer are kind of the demon in this movie. It was incredibly intimate. Now, when it comes to how much of a horror story this actually was, I think the trailer did oversell it a little bit, because by the looks of this trailer, it even looked darker. The trailer itself had a much darker color grade than the actual movie did. So I feel like it was a little bit misleading. Even some of the shots they chose to use made it seem like stuff was going to go down way more than it actually did. It wasn't so much that this presence was ruining the life of the family. I think my favorite case of that has to be in the last 15 years, The Conjuring. Like, that presence in that house was ruining the life of that family. In this case, the presence was really just observing this family, messing with them a little bit like you see in the trailer, but it was just inhabiting this house and allowing you to see into the life of this family. So I felt a little bit misled just because it was a little bit more of a family drama. You have Lucy Liu, who I feel was the biggest name and also the strongest actor in this movie. You also have Chris Sullivan, who you probably know from This Is Us. They are parents to two teenage kids. They are going through a very rough time in their life. This purchase of this new house is supposed to reset their life. Their teenage daughter just went through something pretty traumatic by losing one of her best friends. And all the details about how her friend died slowly creep out through the story. And it's really just a story about grief. It's a story about family. It's a story about just dealing with awful things. And then on top of that, you have the present lurking here. So really, that was the main focal point of this movie. That was the story. The present itself was just the fourth character there to observe it all and to really bring the audience in. You really don't get a first big scare until about 30 minutes into the movie, and every other time that it happens, it's very calculated. Now, when it came to the acting, I was a little bit caught off guard. Lucy Liu is perfect. I thought she completely nailed her role. She by far showed that she is the most seasoned actor in this movie. But everybody else felt a little bit of a downgrade compared to her. And I think that was intentional. I want to believe that that was intentional because I think the story was really trying to capture this family living in the suburbs, interacting the way you would with your brother, with your sister, with your mom and your dad. So I want to feel that they chose this cast and chose the dialogue as a way to represent that. You also have to think that this movie only took 11 days to make, which I felt that too. Not in a bad way, but you can tell that it feels a little bit more like a short story than your average feature-length film, which is why this movie is only an hour and 20 minutes. And the other thing I did enjoy about it that I felt this movie showed that other haunted house movies don't quite get right, which, of course, you always have to live in a big house. It's never going to be in an apartment. It's never going to be in a trailer park like where I grew up because that just doesn't work. That's just not scary. I don't feel like there are enough rooms and twists and turns that you can do in those types of houses. It always has to be a big house. So they still had the big house in this movie, but there was a moment where the family actually had to react to realizing that there was something going on in the house. And they actually reacted in a way that I think a normal family would. Because in most haunted house movies, whenever things start to go down, there's always that one big, like, oh crap, this is actually a thing. For the most part, those movies cut there and they come back the very next day without addressing what happens after that. This movie actually showed that you would actually be freaked out. You would not be wanting to stay in this house. You would be questioning everything. I thought it was cool to address that situation of how do you sleep after this? How do you even feel comfortable in this home you just bought after you just experienced something so creepy? It reminded me of when I lived in what I thought, at least at the time, was a haunted apartment. There was only ever one place I lived in that I truly felt was haunted, where I had these really weird, vivid nightmares that it felt like at times somebody was sitting on my chest, like I was suffering from sleep paralysis. There were other things that happened that were really weird. Like one time my brother was in the kitchen making dinner and the light fixture from overhead, like that big glass thing you put over a light bulb, fell right on his head. That thing had never moved. I don't think we even changed the light bulb at that point. There was no reason for that thing to fall. And we kind of stood there in silence thinking like, that could have knocked me out. That could have been really bad. But there were all these little things that sometimes it just felt like there was something watching me. And I remember one time sleeping in this apartment where I swore there was like a dark figure up in the corner just watching me as I slept in the living room on a mattress that I slept in because I didn't have a bedroom. I just slept on the floor. So maybe I was an easy target. So I have to give this movie a lot of credit for creativity. This is the type of movie that excites me. Before I even stepped foot in that theater, I was genuinely excited to see this story unfold. I'm just happy that stuff like this can not only still get made, but be seen in theaters across the country. And it's already made $5 million, so it's made back its production costs and a little bit on top. And I think it's these types of stories that are going to pave the way for smaller directors. And this is kind of where that sweet spot is. If you can make a low budget movie and create an impact, that is where creativity, that is where filmmaking is going to continue to rise, where studios aren't taking risks on $50 to $60 to $100 million movies that come back and make $10 to $15 million at the box office. And I think the other thing, aside from just creating a spectacle when it comes to kind of flipping the script on a story we've seen before. It was genuinely making characters that you started to feel for. And it was through the process of putting that camera in places where you don't normally expect it and seeing things through the eyes of somebody that's not supposed to be there. This movie is also exciting to me because I could think of me at maybe 12, 13 years old at a time where I was like, I want to be a film director. If I saw a movie like this would inspire me. Much like movies like Halloween, Paranormal Activity inspired me in the past, because it feels like just somebody with creativity and an idea, not a big fancy camera, not a big fancy crew, just that vision and that intent to want to make something creative that people are going to be talking about, people are going to want to see, by somebody who just genuinely cares about the filmmaking process. That is inspiring to me. For Presence, I give it 3.5 out of 5 suburban homes.